The phone rang just as I was setting my cup on the kitchen table, the sound sharp enough to cut through the quiet of the house. I answered without thinking, expecting a routine call or a wrong number. Instead, a steady male voice said, "Sir, we need you at the station now." My hand stiffened around the receiver, as if the weight of it had doubled. Before I could form a question, he added, "Your grandson filed a statement against you." The room seemed to tilt, and for a second I thought the phone might slip from my fingers. I stood there in stillness, listening to the faint background noise of the station. Murmurs, a printer, distant footsteps. The officer didn't sound annoyed or casual. He sounded alert, focused, as if there was something time-sensitive behind his tone. I told him I would come right away, and he ended the call with a short, clipped confirmation. The click on the line felt heavier than it should have. I placed the phone on the counter with more care than I needed to, studying it as if it might ring again and explain itself. As I moved toward the hallway, my mind tried to catch up with what I'd just heard. My grandson's face flashed through my thoughts. The tight jaw, the restless pacing he'd been doing lately, the way he brushed past me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. For weeks there had been a strange tension around him, an impatience that didn't fit the young boy I once knew. I hadn't asked questions. I hadn't wanted to believe the distance was anything more than stress or a bad week. Now the silence between us had turned into something I couldn't ignore. I reached my bedroom to get my jacket and stopped when I saw the bottom desk drawer sitting slightly open. I never left it that way. The top drawer was misaligned too, like someone had pulled it out just far enough to look inside, then pushed it back quickly. I stood there a few seconds, taking in the details, the angle of the drawer, the faint shift in the papers inside, the pen that had rolled to the edge. Someone had moved things. Someone had been searching. The morning call no longer felt like a separate event. It felt connected to this small, quiet intrusion. I slid the drawer fully open and scanned the contents. Nothing seemed missing at first glance, but the order was wrong. My documents were never disorganized. One envelope hadn't been tucked back under the folder where I usually kept it. That was enough to confirm what my body felt before my mind admitted it. Something had been disturbed, and it hadn't been an accident. I closed the drawer gently, letting the click settle into the room like a confirmation I didn't want. As I put on my jacket, I noticed how steady my hands looked despite the cold weight in my chest. Shock has a way of slowing everything down, stripping actions to the basics. I didn't feel anger yet, only a deep, quiet confusion that made each breath feel measured. My house, once predictable and safe, now held signs of a private conversation I hadn't agreed to join. Whatever my grandson filed at the station wasn't the beginning. It was the result of something that had been growing in the dark corners of our home. I stepped outside, locking the door behind me with the same routine motion I'd done for decades. But the morning air felt different, heavier, as if the world had shifted a few inches without telling me. I walked toward the car in a slow, controlled disbelief, knowing the next hours would force me to hear a truth I wasn't prepared for, but could no longer avoid. The drive to the station gave me too much time to sit with the officer's words, and my mind drifted back to the years when my grandson's voice carried a different tone. After my son died, and his mother left town without looking back, it was just the two of us in this house. I was the one who packed his lunches, helped with homework, and sat in the hallway outside his bedroom when nightmares kept him awake. Those memories felt distant now, almost like they belonged to someone else's life. Yet they lingered, reminding me how quickly closeness can turn into something unrecognizable. We stayed side by side through his high school years. He would bring his friends over after class, loud and clumsy, filling the house with noise I didn't mind. He used to sit across from me at the dinner table and talk about the future as if it were something we would both walk into together. But the day he came home from college, something in his eyes had changed. He spoke less, moved faster, and carried a quiet resentment I couldn't trace back to a single moment. It didn't take long for the comments to begin. Soft at first, easy to brush aside. He would walk past me in the hallway and mutter, "You owe me more than you think." Or he'd sigh when I asked simple questions and say, "I wasted years here while my friends went ahead." Sometimes he'd stand in the living room, looking around like a stranger, and say, "This house is too big for one old man." The words didn't come from anger. They came from entitlement, and that made them sharper. Money became his favorite subject. He'd bring up property values or talk about better uses for the land I'd cared for all my life. He said selling would give both of us a fresh start. But the way he worded it always felt like only one of us would benefit. When I refused, he would go quiet for hours, walking through the house like he was measuring losses. I tried to tell myself it was stress or ambition, some growing pain from entering adulthood. But the distance between us widened, and I couldn't bridge it no matter how steady I tried to stay. Then came the bills. He told me he would handle things to make life easier for me. I agreed because I wanted to believe we could still trust each other. But a month later, late notices arrived. Thin envelopes with printed warnings that shouldn't have existed. When I asked, he brushed it off, saying the company must have made a mistake. The irritation in his voice didn't match the calm explanation he tried to give. It was the first clear moment when my instincts whispered that something wasn't lining up. I began watching small details, the way he hid his phone when I walked into the room, the way he closed conversations the moment I appeared, the way his shoulders stiffened whenever I mentioned the house. These weren't confrontations. They were observations a person only makes when trust has already been quietly damaged. I didn't want to admit it, but I found myself wondering who he was becoming and whether the boy I raised was still somewhere inside the man standing in front of me. By the time I parked outside the station, that quiet doubt had settled into something heavier. The officer's call wasn't the start. It was just the moment that brought everything together. I stepped out of the car slowly, knowing I was about to hear the full shape of whatever he had set in motion, and fearing that I already knew more than I wanted to. I first noticed the change on a quiet Tuesday morning when I went to check the mailbox and found it empty, even though the mail truck had passed an hour earlier. My grandson stepped inside moments later with a small stack of envelopes already in his hand. He didn't look surprised to see me standing there. Instead, he held out only 2 pieces, both junk flyers, and slipped the rest into his backpack with a quick, practiced motion. He smiled and said, "I've been getting the mail for you lately. You mix things up sometimes." Nothing about his tone matched the words. There hadn't been a single mistake from me, not even a small one. I let the comment pass, but the unease stayed with me. He had never bothered with the mail before. Now he collected it at the moment it arrived, sorting it in the hallway before I saw any of it. When I asked about a utility bill I hadn't seen, he waved his hand and said, "Already paid," without meeting my eyes. It was the same answer for every missing envelope, every statement that should have come to my hands but didn't. There was a confidence in his voice that suggested he expected no follow-up questions. A few days later, I found the truth he hadn't meant for me to see. His backpack was slumped on the couch while he took a shower, and a corner of an envelope stuck out of the zipper. My name was printed on it in clear black ink. I pulled it out carefully, just enough to read the heading. It was a notice from the bank, one I had never received. The paper was crisp, folded only once, as if it had been set aside before anyone read it. I placed it back exactly as I found it, making sure not to disturb a single crease. The confirmation wasn't dramatic, but it was solid. He wasn't managing my mail, he was intercepting it. That same week, my neighbor stopped me by the fence, his expression uneasy. He mentioned a brief conversation he'd had with my grandson, who had told him I was having a little trouble remembering things lately. The words stunned me more than I let show. I had never forgotten appointments, conversations, or dates. Certainly nothing serious enough to warrant a warning to the neighbors. When I asked what exactly he meant, my neighbor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He said, "You've been mixing up bills," he murmured. Didn't sound right to me. It didn't sound right to me either. But I thanked him quietly and didn't push further. The pattern continued. Calls I didn't hear ring. Visitors told I was resting when I wasn't. Messages relayed through him instead of reaching me directly. He redirected conversations, answered questions meant for me, and moved around the house like someone managing a situation rather than living in it. Each moment was small, almost forgettable on its own. But together, they formed a line I couldn't ignore, each step nudging me farther from the center of my own life. I didn't confront him, not then. Instead, I watched. The shift was subtle, the kind most people never catch if they aren't paying attention. I began noticing how he paused before handing me the phone, how he checked the caller ID longer than necessary, how he positioned himself in doorways when someone came by. None of it was overt, nothing I could point to, but it all carried the same quiet intention. So I stayed still, letting him think I hadn't noticed a thing. There is power in silence, especially when someone believes they've already taken control. I cataloged every detail, every envelope that disappeared, every explanation that didn't line up, every glance he avoided. The small lies were no longer small once they joined together. They were pieces of a plan forming just beyond my view. And for the first time, I began to wonder not what he was hiding, but how long he had been preparing for something I hadn't yet seen. The next morning, while my grandson slept late, I sat at the dining table with the laptop he rarely touched. I typed slowly, checking my bank accounts one by one. The numbers looked right at first, but when I opened the activity log, a cold heaviness settled in my stomach. Several online attempts had been made to access features I'd never used. Changes to beneficiaries, requests for digital paperwork, attempts to authorize secondary management. None were completed, but the timestamps were recent. They lined up with the days he'd insisted on handling things for me. I stared at the screen, letting the confirmation sink in. Someone had been trying to build a path around me. I kept my steps light as I moved down the hall and opened the small desk drawer he assumed I never checked. Inside, between my old receipts and a photo of my wife, sat a stack of printed forms. The heading was familiar enough to chill me. Guardianship documents. They were blank, but several sections had been outlined with yellow highlighter. Boxes for primary decision maker, financial control, and housing authority were marked. He hadn't filled anything in yet, but the preparation was unmistakable. I closed the drawer slowly, as if the papers might make noise if disturbed. Later that afternoon, while I sat in the living room pretending to read the paper, I heard his voice carry from the hallway. He was on the phone, speaking in the low, confident tone he used when he thought he was being responsible. "Once it's official, things will be smoother," he said. "I'll have control soon." He didn't explain what he meant, but the words were enough. He wasn't planning to help me. He was planning to take over. I stepped outside for air, needing a moment away from the walls that suddenly felt too close. My neighbor was trimming branches near the fence and called me over. He looked uneasy, the same way he had the first time he mentioned my grandson's comments. "He asked me something strange the other day," he said quietly. "Wanted to know how those mental fitness tests work, the ones older folks take." He paused, choosing his words. "Said he might need one for you soon." My breath caught, not from shock, but from the realization that everything was lining up into one direction. When I returned inside, my grandson was sitting at the kitchen table, laptop open, papers spread across the surface. He glanced up and said, "You shouldn't be going alone to appointments anymore." His tone wasn't caring. It was assertive, almost rehearsed. "It's better if I come. People get confused at your age." I stared at him, hearing the subtle shift in authority he was trying to slip into place. He said it like a decision had already been made, not a suggestion. His confidence was growing. Mine was changing. I didn't argue. I didn't question. I simply nodded and let him think his words had landed. Arguing would have given him something to use. Silence gave him nothing. I watched how he sat straighter afterward, as if believing my quiet acceptance confirmed everything he'd been planning. But inside, the pieces were clicking into place. The hidden mail, the printed guardianship forms, the bank attempts, the questions to the neighbor, the casual comments meant to weaken my footing. Each one was small, but together they formed a structure he thought I couldn't see. I could see it clearly now. He wasn't acting on impulse. He was building something behind my back with steady, careful hands, something designed to remove mine from the life I'd lived for 76 years. And for the first time, I knew I had to start preparing for whatever came next. The officer led me into a small interview room at the station, the kind with a metal table and walls that absorbed more sound than they reflected. He asked me to sit, then placed a thin folder in front of him. He opened it slowly, as if giving me a moment to brace myself. When he finally read the first line aloud, his voice stayed steady, but the words hit like a blunt blow. My grandson had described me as violent, dangerous, and unfit to care for myself. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten, not from anger, but from the shock of hearing language that didn't belong to my life. The officer paused, watching me with an assessing calm, then read another line. My grandson claimed I had threatened him, an event he described in detail, down to a date and hour that had never existed. I listened without interrupting, trying to steady my breath. Fabrication has a strange weight when it comes wrapped in official language. The room felt smaller with each sentence he read, but I kept my hands folded, not allowing the disbelief inside me to spill out. He turned the page, showing me a document stamped with a date from that very morning. "This was filed today," he said quietly. It was a petition for emergency adult guardianship, with my grandson listed as the petitioner. The form outlined a request for immediate authority over my decisions, property, and medical care. It wasn't filled with the confusion of youth. It was deliberate, structured, and prepared well before today. I stared at the paper, letting the reality settle. He had come to the police before I could even understand what he had been building. The officer didn't push for a reaction. Instead, his tone shifted, calmer, almost protective. He said the filing raised concerns, especially since there had been no prior reports or medical evidence to support such claims. He told me they had reviewed my record, noted the absence of any incidents, and found inconsistencies in my grandson's narrative. His voice held no accusation toward me, only caution, as if trying to brace me for what the system might have become involved in without my knowledge. He continued reading parts of the statement. My grandson had told them I was losing grip, repeating stories, forgetting where I was, and talking about harming myself. None of it had happened, not even in passing. He painted me as a danger to myself and to him, layering lies on top of half-truths, shaping a version of me that fit whatever he needed to justify taking control. Each line revealed more than he realized, not about me, but about what he wanted. I asked the officer calmly if my grandson was still in the building. He shook his head and said he had already left after giving his statement. He insisted we act fast, the officer added. The phrase hung in the air. My grandson wasn't just concerned or confused. He was urgent. That urgency pointed toward motive, not fear. The officer slid the file toward me. "You have the right to know what's being claimed," he said, his tone steady but serious. "And you have the right to protect yourself." That sentence anchored the moment. He wasn't treating me as someone needing supervision. He was treating me as someone targeted. When I stood to leave, the room felt different, heavier. The truth wasn't hidden anymore. It was printed, signed, and filed in a system that could have carried it forward without me even knowing. As I stepped into the hallway, I understood the core threat with absolute clarity. My grandson didn't want my safety. He wanted my authority, every part of it. A social worker arrived while I was still seated in the small interview room, her badge clipped neatly to her jacket and a tablet held against her side. The officer introduced her, then stepped out, leaving the door slightly open. She sat across from me, studying my posture, my breathing, the steadiness of my hands. Her questions were simple and direct. My name, my address, the date, the officer's call this morning. I answered calmly, each response clear and unforced. I could see the certainty forming in her eyes long before she said anything. She recognized right away that nothing about me matched the claims she had been briefed on. When the conversation shifted to my daily routines, she leaned forward slightly, watching for signs of confusion or hesitation. There were none. I described my mornings, my medication schedule, the errands I handled myself, and the way I managed my home. She didn't interrupt. She only nodded, recording details that contradicted every line my grandson had told the police. By the time she finished typing her notes, her expression carried a quiet, professional conclusion. Whatever my grandson had been saying, it wasn't aligning with reality. She asked one final question before standing. "Has anyone suggested you're having trouble with memory or decision-making?" The question was too pointed to be casual. I answered honestly, telling her how my grandson had been framing small mistakes that never happened, collecting my mail before I saw it, and speaking for me when others were around. She didn't react outwardly, but her eyes sharpened in a way that told me she'd seen this pattern before, in other homes, other families. When the officer returned, the two of them spoke just outside the door. Their voices were low, but a few words carried. Inconsistent, unsupported claims, multiple agencies. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from the confirmation that he hadn't just filed one report. He had gone further. When they stepped back inside, the social worker explained that my grandson had contacted more than one agency in recent weeks: Adult Protective Services, a local health office, even a senior welfare hotline. Each time, he had painted a picture of a man slipping mentally, needing someone younger to take charge. The officer placed a small stack of printed notes on the table. They were summaries from the agencies he had contacted, His complaints followed the same script each time: confusion, forgetting tasks, mixing up dates, unsafe behavior. None of it matched anything in my medical history. The officer pointed to the bottom of the page, where the contradictions were listed side by side. My last medical exam showed no cognitive issues. My prescriptions were up to date. There were no accidents, no welfare concerns, no calls from neighbors reporting strange behavior. His story fell apart on contact with facts. The officer sat down across from me, his expression serious but not unkind. "You need to secure your property," he said plainly. "Documents, accounts, anything tied to your name. He's trying to establish a pattern that doesn't exist." His tone carried the weight of someone who had seen cases like this turn dangerous if ignored. He wasn't warning me about confusion or health risks. He was warning me about intent. The social worker added that she would document everything: my clarity, my independence, the lack of evidence for any decline. Her report would counter any ongoing attempts to claim authority over me. She assured me that the guardianship petition would face immediate scrutiny once her findings reached the court. It should have brought relief, but what I felt instead was a cold, quiet understanding. My grandson hadn't acted out of frustration or misunderstanding. He had crossed a line that wasn't accidental. He had built a story about me piece by piece, hoping the system would move faster than the truth. And now that the lies were exposed, he wouldn't simply stop. As I left the station with the officer's warning still echoing in my mind, I understood that this was the point where everything shifted. There was no going back to the house as if nothing had changed. The danger wasn't imagined. It was official, documented, and real. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw my grandson through the living room window, pacing from one end of the room to the other with a tight, restless stride. His shoulders were hunched, his hands opening and closing at his sides, as if he were practicing an argument he hadn't decided how to deliver. The moment I unlocked the door, he stopped pacing but didn't move toward me. His eyes flicked over my face in quick, nervous passes, searching for something he hoped not to find. I walked past him quietly, hanging my jacket on the hook as if this were any other afternoon. The house felt different, charged, unsettled, as though the walls had been listening to him speak while I was gone. I headed toward the bedroom, keeping my steps slow and steady. Inside, I closed the door halfway and opened the old wooden chest beside the dresser. Beneath the spare blankets was the hidden compartment my wife and I had built decades ago. I placed the deed, my identification cards, and the financial papers inside, arranging them neatly so I could reach them quickly if needed. My movements were careful, unhurried, as if the house itself were watching. When I stepped back into the hallway, he was waiting, leaning on the wall with his arms crossed. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone sharp. I told him plainly that I had taken care of something in town. His jaw tightened. "The police called earlier," he said. "Did you talk to them?" He tried to sound casual, but the strain in his voice held too much pressure. He wanted details, but he didn't want to ask openly. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, fear mixing with the need to regain control. I walked to the kitchen and filled a glass of water, letting the silence thicken between us. He followed, keeping several feet of distance, watching every move I made. When I placed the glass on the counter, he shifted toward the window and pulled the curtain aside to look outside. Then he checked the mailbox, then the latch on the back door. Each action was sharper, twitchier, like someone waiting for footsteps that hadn't yet come. His certainty was unraveling, and he didn't know how to hide it. He turned back to me abruptly. "You didn't tell them anything wrong about me, did you?" he asked. The question was too quick, too defensive. I met his eyes without raising my voice. "Why would I need to?" I said. The words landed between us with a calmness he didn't expect. It was a simple test, one quiet sentence that any innocent man would shrug off. Instead, he froze for a second, his breath stopping mid-chest. Then he forced out a laugh that didn't sound like laughter at all. He looked away, rubbing the back of his neck, and said something about making sure everything was straight. But his fingers trembled slightly, and he couldn't keep still. He walked the length of the kitchen twice, then checked the front window again. It was the behavior of someone waiting for consequences, someone who sensed the ground shifting under him. I didn't follow him. I didn't press. I simply observed the fear he was trying to disguise. The house that had once held easy silence between us now held something else, an unspoken knowledge that whatever he had tried to build was beginning to crack. The officer's warning echoed in my mind, aligning perfectly with the scene unfolding in front of me. As he paced, I felt a new steadiness settle inside me. Not anger, not shock, just a firm understanding of what needed to happen next. I could no longer treat this as confusion or misunderstanding. The plan he had been constructing was real, and it had already crossed too many lines to ignore. The truth was rising whether he wanted it to or not, and I knew the moment was coming when it would finally surface in full. He waited until dusk before cornering me. Choosing the moment the house felt smallest. I had just stepped into the hallway when he moved in front of me, blocking the path with a stack of papers clutched in his hand. His voice was low, but tense. "We need to finish these safety documents," he said. He held the papers out as if they were routine forms, though his grip was tight enough to crease the edges. His posture told the truth. This wasn't a request. It was his last attempt to force something through before the ground slipped completely from underneath him. When I didn't reach for the papers, he took a step closer and extended his hand. "Give me your phone," he said, "and the keys. I'll keep things organized from now on." His tone had changed. The softness he once used to sound helpful was gone, replaced by a sharp urgency that exposed how badly he needed control. His eyes darted to my pockets and back to my face, as if trying to decide how far he needed to push. I held my ground and told him we should sit. The calmness in my voice stopped him for a second, long enough for me to take the folder I'd prepared earlier from the table. I opened it slowly, laying out the printouts one by one. The bank logs showing unauthorized attempts, the guardianship documents he highlighted, the mail he'd hidden with my name still sealed on the front. Each piece was placed carefully, like evidence presented before a jury. I watched his face change with every page. First denial, then fear, then something harder, darker, settling into place. "This isn't what you think," he muttered, though his voice had lost its firmness. He grabbed the edge of the table as if steadying himself, then dragged his hand through his hair in a frantic motion. "You're making things harder than they need to be. You're ruining everything I've been trying to fix." The word fix came out sharp, resentful. He wasn't defending his actions. He was blaming me for exposing them. When he reached for the papers, he didn't try to hide the desperation. He grabbed all he could, clenching them in both hands, fumbling to tear through them. The sound of ripping paper cut through the room like something breaking open. I stepped back, keeping distance, watching the panic unravel what was left of his composure. He tried again, tearing smaller pieces, breathing harder as if destroying the pages would erase the truth written on them. A muffled thud echoed against the wall as he slammed the torn pieces onto the floor. The noise must have carried outside, because a moment later, our neighbor's voice came from the doorway. "Everything all right in here?" he called out, already stepping inside without waiting for permission. He took in the scene, the shredded pages, my grandson's trembling hands, the tightness in my posture, and moved fast toward the table. My grandson froze, then tried to gather the scattered pieces again, but the neighbor's presence broke whatever resolve he had left. The neighbor placed a firm hand on his arm. "Sit down," he said quietly. "You need to stop." It wasn't forceful, but it was decisive, and it stripped away the last of my grandson's attempts to control the moment. While he sank into the chair, breathing thin and shaky, the neighbor pulled out his phone. His voice stayed steady as he spoke to emergency services, explaining the situation, without exaggeration, just simple facts in a calm tone that carried weight. My grandson didn't interrupt. He stared at the torn documents on the floor, the panic now replaced by a hollow, defeated stillness. When the paramedics and officers arrived, the house fell into a controlled kind of order. They separated us, asked quiet questions, and examined the scene. No shouting, no struggle, just supervision, structure, and the clear end of a confrontation that had been building long before tonight. As they led my grandson outside, his shoulders slumped, I stood in the corner of the room, feeling a cold clarity settle where confusion once lived. Whatever relationship we had before this moment was gone, and the truth, finally, was no longer hidden. The officers guided my grandson into a separate room the moment they arrived, closing the door behind him with a steady, deliberate motion. I stayed in the living room with one officer while the others documented the scene, photographing the torn papers on the floor, the highlighted forms on the table, and the bank logs I had laid out earlier. Their movements were calm, procedural, each one confirming what I already knew. His accusations had collapsed under the weight of facts he couldn't control. After a few minutes, the officer beside me received an update through his radio. He nodded once and began typing notes into his tablet, reading portions of the collected statements aloud to ensure accuracy. My grandson's report claimed I was unstable, violent, and unable to manage basic tasks. The officer compared those words with the social worker's earlier assessment and the doctor's records they had pulled during the welfare check. The contrast was so sharp it didn't need commentary. His narrative wasn't just exaggerated, it was fabricated. They questioned him for nearly an hour in the other room. I couldn't hear much through the door, but occasionally his voice rose in short, clipped bursts before falling quiet again. The officers were patient, but their tone carried the weight of evidence rather than sympathy. They asked him to explain the guardianship documents, the hidden mail, the attempts to alter financial access logs. Each question seemed to corner him further. He had built a story with no foundation, and now he was being asked to stand on it. A social worker arrived midway through the questioning, bringing her full report. She sat with me at the dining table, her voice low and professional as she summarized her findings. Cognitive clarity intact, daily function stable, no signs of decline, no history of confusion. She had documented the inconsistencies in his claims, the lack of medical basis for his concerns, and his pattern of controlling behavior. She handed the packet to the lead officer, who read it silently before placing it into a larger case file marked with today's date. My lawyer arrived shortly after. He reviewed the printed guardianship petition, his jaw tightening slightly as he skimmed through the highlighted sections. Then he closed the file and said, in his steady way, that my estate and decision-making rights remained fully protected. The petition, he explained, was already being dismissed based on the reports filed today. He overreached, the lawyer said softly, and the system saw it. The officers reconvened in the living room and informed me that charges were being considered: false reporting, attempted coercion, and elder manipulation. They explained the process calmly, making sure I understood that filing a guardianship petition under false claims carried consequences. They also said a no-contact order would be issued, effective immediately. He would not return to my house. He would not be permitted to manage my affairs. Every attempt he made to control my life had now become part of a documented record. When they escorted him out, he didn't look at me. His shoulders were slumped, his steps unsteady, as if he were still trying to understand how everything had turned against him so quickly. The officers kept a steady, respectful distance on either side of him. The door closed behind them with a quiet finality. The house settled into stillness again, but it wasn't the comforting silence I once knew. It was heavier, filled with the understanding that the boy I raised had chosen a path I couldn't pull him back from. I didn't feel anger, not even relief, just a tiredness that ran deep, the kind that comes when trust breaks in a way that can't be repaired. I sat at the table, looking at the torn pieces of paper still scattered on the floor. They felt like a map of the last few months, quiet cuts, hidden traps, choices made when I wasn't looking. The officers offered to help clean up before leaving, but I told them I would handle it. Some things, even painful things, you clean up yourself. The house felt larger after the officers left, as if the walls had stepped back to give me room to breathe again. I sat in the quiet for a long time, letting the weight of the day settle the way dust does after something heavy falls. I kept thinking about how long I had ignored the early signs, not because I didn't see them, but because love has a strange way of softening edges that should stay sharp. When he made those first remarks about the house, or when he hid small things, or when he spoke for me in front of others, I told myself it was stress, confusion, youth. I let affection take the place of caution, and it blurred my judgment more than age ever had. As I replayed the past months in my mind, I realized how entitlement doesn't appear suddenly. It grows quietly, stretching through small favors, small resentments, and small assumptions until it becomes something bigger than either person expects. He didn't start with guardianship papers. He started with comments about helping, about simplifying things, about doing what's best. It's the slow pace that makes it dangerous, the kind that sneaks into routines and conversations until you forget it wasn't always there. By the time the truth stands in front of you, it's already been growing for years. I walked through the house, checking each room with a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. I opened cabinets, checked drawers, and made a list of everything tied to my name, not out of fear, but out of understanding. I spent decades building this life, this home, this sense of independence. It deserved the same level of care now that it did when I first turned the key 40 years ago. I decided I would keep every document secure, every account monitored, every decision transparent to the people who actually had my best interests at heart. Neutral professionals exist for a reason. Sometimes you need someone who has no emotional stake to stand between you and whoever thinks they deserve more than you owe. Healing didn't come in a wave. It came in small pieces. The steady quiet of the house at night, the familiar creak of the hallway floorboards, the simple act of making my own dinner without someone watching over my shoulder. I didn't try to explain away what my grandson had done. I didn't search for excuses or childhood moments to soften it. Some choices aren't accidents. Some lines, once crossed, stay crossed forever. My path forward wasn't forgiveness. It was boundaries, firm, necessary boundaries that allowed me to reclaim what had been slipping away without me noticing. As the days passed, I found a calm I hadn't felt in years. Living alone didn't feel lonely. It felt honest. My home looked the way it should, not staged, not managed, not watched. I opened the windows in the morning, let the air drift in, and listened to the sounds of a life that finally felt like mine again. Each morning reminded me that autonomy is a kind of peace you don't appreciate until someone tries to steal it from you. Sitting by the window one evening, I watched the light fade across the yard. The house was quiet, but not heavy. It carried a stillness that felt earned. I didn't think about what happened earlier that week. I thought about the years ahead, years where I would protect what mattered, stay aware of small changes, and never hand over control simply because family asked for it. Age teaches a man many things, but the clearest lesson I've learned is this: love your family, but never let anyone rewrite your life while you're still living it.